Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Halion 7 tutorial series. Today we're going to take our first of two looks at frequency modulation, or FM. This is a huge subject. Today we're going to cover the basics and I'm going to teach you all of the fundamentals required to get you up and running, building your own sounds with FM. In the next episode we'll have a look at some of the more advanced features in Halion. Hope you're enjoying the series so far. If you are, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. Awesome way to help support my channel. So here I've initialized an FM synth zone, and out of the box it sounds like this. Simple sine wave. FM synthesis contains some very unique terms that you need to learn as soon as possible. One of the most important of those terms is the term operator. Now, an operator is simply an oscillator, but in frequency modulation we call them operators. And so from this point onwards I'm going to try to avoid using the word oscillator as much as possible. The reason we use this unusual term is that operators can perform one of two tasks. Every operator in an FM synth is either a carrier or a modulator. In the default patch that you get when you create an initialized FM synth zone, you only have carriers. See these 8 colored boxes? They're all currently generating audio output, and therefore they're carriers. That's what defines an operator as being a carrier. It's the thing that you hear. Everything that isn't a carrier is a modulator. It's an operator that's designed to modulate another component, another operator in the system. Now we're going to get onto modulators very shortly. We can't do everything all at once. At the moment I just want to hear and deal with the concept of carriers. So we have this zone, as you've heard, it's generating a sine wave. 7 of these carriers are currently muted. All of the operators from 2 up to 8 are all muted, but carrier number 1 is at level 99. That's what you're hearing. You're hearing the sine wave generated by carrier number 1. The reason it's generating a sine wave, if we jump over to the frequency tab, is that this operator is currently generating a sine wave. If we switch it to saw. Okay, very uninspiring stuff so far. We've got a sine wave generator, big deal. Let's introduce our first modulator. Now for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to get there via a preset. At the moment, as I said, all 8 operators are carriers. We don't have any modulators in our system. We can actually manually define the configuration of these operators ourselves, but we're not going to do that just yet. It's a little bit advanced. I'm going to do it via a preset, and I'm going to select DX01. The Yamaha DX7 is the most famous frequency modulation synthesizer of all time, not even close. Introduced in 1983, it defined a brand new form of synthesis. Had never been seen before, and Yamaha went on to dominate the 1980s as a result of this synthesizer. So the DX7 presets are very famous. When I select DX701, now we get a new configuration of operators, and for the first time we've introduced modulators into the system. The configuration of colored boxes in a frequency modulation synthesizer is called an algorithm. The algorithm is the order in which the operators are connected together. Have a close look at this algorithm. The boxes at the bottom of the chart, numbers 4 and 6, are carriers. And so in this configuration, in this algorithm, operators 1, 2, 3 and 5 are all modulators, and operators 4 and 6 are carriers. They are generating the audio tone. The 4 boxes above are modulating that audio tone. Now before we go on to have a more detailed look of how this particular algorithm is configured, I'm going to press a key on the keyboard to demonstrate something that's a little bit unusual. Here we go. Absolute silence. The reason for that is that we've just selected an algorithm preset, but do you remember our previous configuration had operator number 1 as a carrier and the only thing that was currently generating tone? Operators 2 to 8 were all set to level 0, in other words they were effectively muted. Operator 1 in this algorithm is at the top of the chain. It's a modulator. It's changing some other part of the system. The 2 carriers down at the bottom of the algorithm, 4 and 6, both have level 0, and so you're not hearing any sound. Only the operators at the bottom of the algorithm are capable of generating audio output. They're both set to 0, and so you're not hearing anything. When you select an algorithm preset, all you're doing is changing the configuration of the operators, how they're connected together. You're not changing any of the configurable parameters in the preset. Okay, so let's get this algorithm generating some tone. I'll select carrier number 4. I'll increase its level to 99 and turn it down a bit because it's a bit loud. There we have our sine wave back. Now alarm bells might be clanging in your brain for a different reason. Here we have an operator in the chain that's set to a non-zero level. Why isn't this having some impact on carrier number 4? We have a modulator that's connected to carrier number 4, albeit indirectly. Why isn't it having any impact on the sound? Well, it's because operator number 1, modulator number 1, is only modulating operator number 2. Operator number 2, which is also a modulator, it's not sat at the bottom of the algorithm, its level is 0. Now, if you think about modulation from the perspective of depth, if you have an LFO with a modulation depth of 0, it doesn't matter what it's connected to. It's not going to have any impact on the pitch or the volume or whatever that LFO happens to be connected to. That's exactly the case here. Modulator number 1 is working as hard as it possibly can, but the thing it's doing is not having any other impact on the system. Modulator number 2 is set to 0. So if any operator in your algorithm has a level of 0, it's having no impact on anything below it. And so because we have this disconnect between operators number 1 and 4, number 1 isn't doing anything. In order for us to modulate the carrier, operator number 4, which is the one that's generating audio tone, we need to make a change to modulator number 3. Only these little lines determine where the signal is flowing. You don't get to magically jump over operators. That's not how it works. So let's introduce our first modulation into the system. I'm going to turn up the level of modulator number 3. Let's see what it sounds like. So now we have a far more complex sound. Have a look at it in the spectrum analyzer and the oscilloscope. A really complex set of frequencies way beyond the original sine tone. Bring the modulator back down again. There's your original tone. The modulator is having a very dramatic impact on that carrier wave. So what is the modulator? Well, it's a sine wave. Jump over to the frequency page. You can see it's generating a sine wave. Absolutely nothing spectacular is going on inside this operator. It's because it's acting as a modulator that we're getting such a complex tone. But I'm not going to ask you to take my word for that. I'm going to prove it. What I'm going to do is copy all of the settings of modulator number 3, and I'm going to copy it somewhere else in the system. So we have little copy and paste symbols down in the bottom of this main viewer. I'm going to copy the operator settings, and I'm going to paste them into operator number 6. Operator number 6 is at the bottom of the algorithm, and therefore it's capable of generating audio tone. It's a carrier. So if I paste into operator 6, I've now copied all of the settings from operator 3 over into operator 6. See, when I switch between the two, they're absolutely identical. All I need to do now is mute the other carrier chain, the left-hand side of the algorithm. Let's turn carrier number 4 off. Now we can only hear carrier number 6. Told you. Sine wave, as simple as it gets. Going right back to the beginning of the episode, operators number 2 to 8 were all muted, so we know that operator number 5 is still muted. It's a modulator, but it's having no impact on any other part of the system. This operator, whose settings I just copied from 3 to 6, is generating a sine wave at 130 Hz. When that sine wave is used as a modulator, turn level 6 down, level 4 up. You get this complex interaction between the two systems. Frequency modulation at audio levels generates very complex harmonics. At low levels, when you have a low frequency oscillator applying frequency modulation, we call it vibrato, and you get that lovely wobbling tonal sound. Well, beyond about 15 or 20 Hertz, that stops happening. You can't identify individual oscillations anymore. So a modulator cycling at 130 Hertz, modulating the pitch of another sine wave, manifests as this really complex, very interesting sound, and that's the basis of frequency modulation. The beauty of FM is in being able to chain modulators together. So here we have modulator number 3, which, as we've seen, is applying pitch modulation to carrier number 4. But now we can fully complete this algorithm by introducing modulator number 2 as well. So let's turn up the level of that. And remember, modulator 1, right at the top of the chain, has always been set at level 99. Now what are we going to get? Significantly more complex, significantly different sound. So just take a moment to have a think about what's happening here. We have a single sine wave carrier, operator number 4. It's being modulated by a sine wave cycling at 130 Hz. That modulator is being modulated by a sine wave cycling at 130 Hz. That modulator is being modulated by a sine wave cycling at 130 Hz. We don't generally try to visualize frequency modulation because it's simply too complex. What we can do, however, is use our ears to generate cool sounds. That's really what it's all about. So I can now start manipulating the level of these 3 different modulators to see what effect I'm going to get on the system. So I'm changing the relative impact, the relative depth that each of these modulators is having on the next successive link in the chain. So operator 1 is having this much effect on modulator 2, and so on and so on. Here, as I'm pulling back the modulation depth of operator number 3, everything above it is having a less and less impact on the overall sound because modulator 3 is the master modulator. It's the one that finally determines how much depth gets to carrier number 4. If I turn it all the way down to 0, we're back to the sine wave that we started from. Now, no introduction to the principles of FM is complete without the time-honoured creation of our own bell tone. So we're going to generate a sound from scratch. I'm going to try to emulate the sound of a bell. I'm just going to use 2 operators in order to do this, 1 carrier and 1 modulator. So I'm going to turn down operator number 4. I don't need the more complex chain. Let's start off with a simple sine wave. Okay, so what are the characteristics of a bell sound? It has a very sharp percussive attack, a very fast descent from that initial transient, down to a very brief shelf where the sound immediately starts tailing away. Bells generally, however, have a very long release, so we're going to get an instant hit, an immediate drop off, and then a slower tailing away of the sound over time. So I need to draw that amplitude envelope before I go any further. I'm not worried about the tonal complexity of the sound at the moment, just want to get an amplitude envelope up and running. Now I could do that via the master amplitude envelope, which is always available to us in any zone, but every operator in an FM synth has its own amplitude envelope, so I'm going to do it from there. It's done in the level tab, so for carriers the level tab is describing the amplitude envelope. For modulators it's basically describing the depth envelope, how much impact the modulator is going to have on the operator below it. So I want a significant release. I'm just basically dragging the release time up here, and you can see that change happening in the graphical editor. So this is an ADDSR envelope. We have 2 decays, decay 1 and 2. Otherwise it's a pretty straightforward envelope. So there's my initial hit, coming down to a lower shelf, which is a bit quiet actually, turn that up a bit. And then my release. Okay, so that's a nice percussive sound. Now we want all of those tingly overtones that we get from a bell. I'm going to introduce those via the modulator. So operator 5 is going to be our modulator. Let's turn up the level. And I need its release curve to be the same as the carriers. So let's increase the release. Okay. So there's the modulator having an impact on the carrier, but obviously it doesn't sound very much like a bell. The secret to generating bell sounds is to have very fast modulation, generates very high overtones and a very sharp sound. So we can make the modulator, operator number 5, oscillate at a much faster rate than the native key that I'm pressing. We have a coarse tuning control down at the bottom of the FM zone that allows us to determine the natural pitch, the natural frequency of the operator that we're editing. At the moment, it's set to the same as the carrier. They're both set to 1. I make the modulator, operator 5, oscillate much faster than the carrier. We're going to get there very quickly. See how instantly how easy it is to generate a bell sound. This is why it's FM Synthesis 101. It's such an easy tone to generate. So that's 2 operators, both using sine waves. All I've done is sped up one relative to the other, the modulator. Keep on going. And by selecting different rates, different ratios of modulator to carrier, we select the particular type of. All I've used is 2 sine waves there, and I've very quickly got a functional bell sound up and running. It's worth mentioning at this point, one of the best ways to learn frequency modulation is to play with existing algorithms. At the moment, all we've done is change the algorithm itself, basically the configuration of the operators. But at the top right-hand corner of the zone, we have a preset bank, and these are fully featured presets that will change all of the features inside your zone as well. So if we choose one of the chromatic percussion options from in there, we're going to get a much richer interpretation of what Halion thinks a bell should sound like. And as you can see, this is using 5 carriers with various modulators plugging into those carriers. This is a great way to learn how things hang together. Let's hear what Bell 01 sounds like. So if I hold a key down, we're turning into a synth now. And it's obviously trivially easy to mute any number of these carriers. I happen to know for this particular preset, for instance, that carrier number 5 is generating the substantial bell sound. And if we mute that and listen to one of the other carriers, got tonal flavour. You can also hear panning that carries predominantly in the left ear. We're not going to go too far down that particular rabbit hole today, except to say if we jump over to the algorithm page, we can see the panning, and here's operator 6, and you can see that it's been panned left. So in the next episode, we'll have a good old wander around this page and figure out how to manipulate the algorithms in much greater detail. Let's dial up one of the other presets. Go back into my preset bank, and I'm going to select Synth Comp 1. Kind of synth bass sort of sound, quite a nice basic sound to play with. Here's our algorithm. Operators 4 and 8 are now acting as the carriers. Everything else is a modulator. Even though operator number 2 is at the bottom of its own chain, it's not a carrier. It's one of 2 modulators feeding in to operator number 4. The reason I've dialed up this particular preset is because it's a good illustration of the concept of parameter stretching. Frequency modulation synthesizers use relative values. None of these numbers really mean anything in their own context. This particular decay value here is set to 63, but there are so many different ways that parameters can be manipulated in FM synths. This is just a starting point. So we have these amplitude curves. As I wander around the operators, see the various, very slightly but significantly different amplitude curves for each one of the operators. All of that can be stretched. If we stretch a carrier's amplitude curve, we're going to make its attack times and its decay times get longer. If we stretch a modulation curve, we're going to take it longer for that modulation to have an impact on the sound. Halion gives us a really nice shortcut method of playing with that. We have these master controls on the left-hand side of the zone that allow us to stretch all values simultaneously across all operators of either modulator or carrier type. Without any further ado, it's better if I just start playing notes, playing with some of these controls, and you'll hear how dramatically I can impact the sound. By pulling the time of all of those modulations down, all of the amplitude curves of the modulators are now acting much faster, Get a much sharper sound. The modulators breathing more as it takes them longer to get from their initial level up to their maximum level. Let's stretch those maximum levels by increasing the modulation levels knob. So now I'm basically, all of the, what might be a 63 is kind of getting pushed, but I'm not turning 63 up to 70. I'm turning every level up on the entire modulation system simultaneously. So that's the modulators basically really pushing what they're doing below the chain. All of these different modulators feeding into each other, having that really dramatic impact on the sound. Just get that little bit of kind of noise breakup. The modulators are basically distorting the sound so radically that we're getting that noise, but it's so brief. Just getting a lovely little kind of percussive hit. Let's make the carrier times longer. So now the sound takes longer to evolve. The amplitude or volume of the carriers is going to take longer to evolve. So now I've distorted the entire wave, both the carrier and the modulation times, dramatically expanded. It's taking much longer for these amplitude curves to evolve. And I've also pushed the levels, so basically the maximum amount of modulation that all of these operators can have on each other. That's also being enhanced. Now sounds nothing like that original sound that we had, which was kind of like a synth-based sound. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks very much.